I'm calling on the South Australian chief executives of our largest departments and our wealthiest departments to do something about women in construction. I think when I started there was about 350 employees and 6 women in the whole division.
Yeah, that's not good, is it?
So it's not just about women and it's not just about Aboriginal people, but it's about men's mental health, and it's about ensuring that the families feel valued and important, and I'm able to have discussions directly with partners and things and their children, so we can just have that connection. I'm going to call it for what it was. It was very tokenistic.
Welcome to NAWIC Couch. Would you like to introduce yourself to us?
Yeah, my name's Kiara Johnson. I'm the owner, founder and managing director of Platinum Civil Construction, also KSJ Consulting Services and Argyle Group Training Organisation. I'm an Aboriginal woman with connections to Ngadjuri, Narungga and Ghana. I grew up on Nookanu country, also known as Port Pirie, South Australia.
It is such an honour to have you here today. I first became aware of you at an event which was about driving participation in the construction industry, particularly in South Australia. And what stood out to me and others was your ability to really clearly articulate your stance on issues that we in South Australia have in regard to procurement as it relates to specifically gender-based quotas and also Indigenous engagement. So I was hoping you could share those opinions with me again today.
Yeah, I guess I have a real self-interest in driving participation for women in construction and, of course, Aboriginal people in construction. Mm-hmm. And predominantly that's because of my lived experience. Growing up in regional South Australia, I faced, I guess, barriers to education and, you know, due to my geographical location, and there wasn't sort of any programs in those, you know, the early 2000s to support me with higher education. So my pathway to those things that I'm, you know, now living the dream, essentially doing, was through lived experience rather than higher education and then, you know, opportunities. So, you know, I worked between Aboriginal affairs and civil construction industry, also mining. So through that, I developed, I guess, a deeper understanding of the challenges for women, but also the challenges for Aboriginal people. And through my employment on the Torrens to Torrens project as a HR administrator, I was tasked with, you know, generating reports and data around our participation levels when the industry participation in South Australia was quite a new topic of discussion, and it was really focused on South Australian businesses, ex-automotive industry workers, and those sorts of things. I don't actually recall anything about women in construction being in that document, and further to that, it was only related to Aboriginal employment participation. So my observations were that a lot of Aboriginal people were getting jobs in the field and standing around and not really having any clarity or direction or support in the field in terms of their career and their opportunities, and it become really uncomfortable and almost and I guess I'm going to call it for what it was. It was very tokenistic. Yeah. So I started to develop in my own time strategic ideas, proposals to leadership around how we could increase particularly Aboriginal participation, but also look at Aboriginal businesses. Mm-hmm. And that was prior to Aboriginal business being any sort of policy context in South Australia. So, and I guess the challenges I was experiencing as a woman, I was also a single mum. So, you know, getting kids to childcare at 7, you know, getting to pre-start at 7 when childcare doesn't open till 7:30, 6:30 is, you know, almost impossible. So I was just lucky at the time to have a really great leader that was enabled my flexibility. However, there was still that need for me to be able to attend, particularly in the HR space, attend pre-starts and understand how people were feeling across site and get the vibe and have, general yarns with people at all different levels across the project. So, which is really important to me today is what it was then. So I guess that sort of continued to drive my passion around being the underdog, if you like, or having those barriers. And so I was approached by the Department of Infrastructure and Transport. They were interested in my skills beyond the Torrens to Torrens project. I moved over to the Department of Infrastructure and Transport in a sort of part-time administrative role with the thought of moving into Aboriginal affairs and industry participation within the department. However, I got pregnant, or I was pregnant at the time unknowingly, with my third child. So that sort of, I guess, restricted my ability to continue along my career aspirations. And, we're talking about 2017 here. And those are the thought processes I was having in what we would deem as quite a progressive organisation, being a state government agency. So I guess I'm a realist, and I had to understand where, as a woman in an organisation like that, how was I going to progress my career? Of course, having my first two children, I took large back steps in my career already, so I sort of accepted that was the way it is for women. So yeah, took some short-term maternity leave, so that I could get back into the workplace as quickly as I could, so that I didn't lose my that momentum and that reputation within the agency and the industry. Found myself working with a exceptional female leader in a department of the or a division of the organisation, which was, I think when I started there was about 350 employees and 6 women in the whole division.
Yeah, that's not good, is it?
Yes. And my female boss being the most senior person within that division. And the challenges and adversity that she faced and had to endure was, again, quite, I guess, it was a huge learning for me. Mm-hmm. And she was much more experienced. She had an engineering degree. She was also a single mum, however, with 2 children. But I actually didn't know that, because I believe now when I reflect on it, I think she kept that closely guarded because, like a lot of us women, that we keep our private lives a lot more sort of concealed, so that we're not judged or, that's not then used against us, because there's been plenty of times that's happened to me as well.
Yeah.
So long story short, her and I worked extremely difficult, in an extremely difficult work environment, and I persevered with that for a couple of years, and then I decided that the government employment with the government wasn't for me, because I've got this drive and passion for Aboriginal affairs and participation, and I felt like I was very restricted by government policy and red tape, and I wasn't able to actually fulfill or use all my skills, if you like, to be able to drive that through the industry. So I decided to resign from my position. I had no idea how I was going to pay my mortgage, how I was going to feed my kids. I don't come from a family I don't come from intergenerational wealth. There's not one person in my family that's completed higher education beyond year 12, other than myself having a couple of diplomas, but certainly no tertiary degrees or those sorts of things. So I then really inspired, I guess, to make it work, and I was very nervous. But within the first 2 weeks, I was engaged by the industry advocate directly to work on a contract in the far north called bringing together traditional owners and Aboriginal businesses in regional South Australia and really driving Aboriginal business opportunities. And that has been quite successful to date, even though I'm not part of it anymore. I'm a member of it, but I'm actually not a director or a consultant on that project. But that's the first time since I'm guessing colonisation that Aboriginal people have been able to come together and trade, essentially, because that's been obviously due to colonisation. That's been part of the destruction of our culture and our cultural practices, because we were, we did trade with other groups. We come together, and Port Augusta was actually where this organisation's based, was actually a hub for trading for multiple Aboriginal nation groups across South Australia. So for me to be able to connect with my culture, connect back with my community, but also work with Aboriginal community, but driving economic participation and self-empowerment and self-determination, it ticked all the boxes for me. So that was sort of the journey where I started my businesses.
Have you always had that drive within you?
I think, I remember being a child, I was quite competitive with sport and those sorts of things. I captained the B grade women's hockey team at 13 years old, so I think there was always that sort of pathway to, and I say leadership because I like to think that I'm a leader, not a manager.
What's the difference?
Well, I certainly think that a manager is someone that more dictates what actually happens, whereas a leader, considers and values all people's opinions and diverse ways of thinking, and, is open to constructive feedback and likes to, for me, I always say the reason why my businesses have been so successful to date is because I hire people smarter than me, and I lead them and sort of try to inspire them in what their individual skill sets and what they're good at, and acknowledge that, I've got a certain skill set and I need to hire other people where I have more, I guess, essentially weaknesses, and I see strengths in theirs, and bringing these people together is what makes a really successful organisation.
Tokenism and quotas. Can you talk to me about how you feel about quotas and their place in our industry?
Yeah, well, certainly I think it would be a good start for South Australia to even have a women in construction quota, would be a good start. Although I don't think quotas are essentially the long-term answer, I think they're a good start. We've seen that with Aboriginal participation, but now we've seen the ugly of it too, in terms of black cladding, issues where Aboriginal people have been taken advantage of, given, business structures and joint ventures and those things that can be, people work their way around policy essentially, and they find the gaps, and it's human nature, right? Particularly in the business environment. So I think we've got a lot of learnings at that end of the scale where we can start quotas and start targets and put emphasis on women in particular in construction to drive that participation, because we're talking about a skills crisis in this state, yet we haven't actually developed policy that actually supports that skills crisis. So we're talking about, the federal government, the state government, putting in significant funding for this skills crisis, but there really being no strategy around it and no engagement with women in construction about that. I find it really frustrating when government and policymakers make decisions on behalf of people in the industries, particularly like myself as a female Aboriginal business owner. It has been very rare and few and far between has someone actually had a conversation with me about where I see a women in construction policy actually benefiting this state.
And unfortunately, you are rare. So to have someone with all of those intersectionalities that you just listed, there's not many of you. If you're going out and looking for the opinions of those people, you would have to be on that list. So it's not a short leap to say, we're not getting talked to because no one's talking to you.
And this is exactly the problem, right? So as a business owner, it is challenging for me to walk in two worlds in terms of I own a business. It's a for-profit organisation, but it's also a social enterprise, right?
Yes.
Because on the basis that it's an Aboriginal-owned business. So for me, what that means to me means that I have certain obligations to my community. It means that I'm sitting here with you right now, for example, talking about how passionate I am about these things. I do a huge amount of volunteer work in the Aboriginal community in terms of magnifying the voices of our community around water rights, the right to clean drinking water in Australia, the UN rights of Indigenous people, discussing those issues that are the fundamental principles of what underpins policy for the disadvantaged people in this country. And for people, I think, particularly around strong women, there's a real fear. Regardless of the fact I'm Aboriginal, there is a real fear about having a conversation with a woman that has the experience in the industry and is quite happy to give constructive feedback.
Where do you think the fear comes from?
It's driven from the unknown, as we can see in government today. I mean, you see in terms of our state government, we have a huge, we've got record numbers in female ministers, right? But then when you look at the portfolios of those female ministers, they're the most difficult portfolios in the state in terms of child protection and human services and those sorts of things, that those areas that are well underfunded, very, very difficult portfolios, whereas the male ministers have got the portfolios where all the money is, where all the big wins are, and perhaps that's happened naturally. I'm not saying that that's been a deliberate, attempt at sabotaging us female leaders. Like, Susan Close is one of my, I admire her deeply. And, people, young ministers like Rhiannon Pearce, from country South Australia, someone I grew up with, just incredible female leaders, but they've got their own adversities within their own organisations. And unless women are elevated to make decisions and have an authentic, genuine seat at the table, then it becomes, those sorts of positions become tokenistic. Under the previous government, we've seen less female ministers, but more female chief executives. Now, for me, chief executives drive the policy. They create the policy. The ministers create the legislation and beyond that, sometimes the regulations, and drive the funding. However, at the end of the day, the chief executives have, the power to make the most change. So, through something like this, I'm calling on the South Australian chief executives of our largest departments and our wealthiest departments to do something about women in construction, because at the moment there's an unfair advantage to male-owned businesses and men in the construction industry because they far outweigh women in the industry. And that's just, we could talk about those barriers consistently.
Yeah, and to those people who are in those positions to make those decisions, who say, well, I don't really know what to do, come and talk to us. Come talk to us.
Exactly.
Come sit on NAWIC couch. We'll go
exactly.
there. We don't have to do it with the lights and the cameras, but there's a lot of people in this industry, like yourself, like a lot of the people involved in the NAWIC SA chapter, who
That's right.
have a lot of passion and a lot of drive, but they're coming up against a wall. And what happens when people with passion and drive consistently come up against a wall is they stop trying.
And they get burnt out. I think we had a bit of a yarn before we got on the camera and the microphones, and I said to you, I'm very, very tired. For the last month, I've been dealing with significant mansplaining, and I actually tried to explain to the people that made me feel that way, what that actually means. And it was quite funny because I Googled it to see if there was a real easy way to explain it to them, because it was something new to them. And it was in a, you know, it was my attempt to be constructive about the way they were making me feel. So I wasn't being called out in a room or anything. It was in a, you know, little space. And I said, this is the way you're making me feel. And then I seen this photo on the internet, and it said this man saying, no, you're not being mansplained, and pointing at this woman and you know, and it's a bit like racism.
Yes.
You know, I've experienced that firsthand in terms of, you know, raising an issue around racism and then being told, but that by a non-Indigenous middle-aged white man, that was not that comment is not racist. You know, so I feel like, back to your question around fear, what drives that fear is a lack of knowledge.
Yes. And
excellent leaders, like I said to you before, will accept constructive feedback. They will open their door to listen to, you know, to the skills and experiences of those around them, because these people can't do it alone. And the most incredible women, and I think that's a female leadership superpower, is that we're not afraid to open that door. You look at the likes of the governor of South Australia, Frances. I mean, Her Excellency has held incredibly high positions in the federal government as a foreign affairs leader. And you could imagine, given her age, her demographic in terms of her age, you could only imagine what that woman had to experience working, you know, with under some of the ministers that she had, you know, only 10, 20 years ago, right? So we have moved forward, but we're still not seeing leaders driving change. We're seeing managers making decisions about policy and not engaging, and not at a level where, you know, the international participation guidelines, actually, it's all there. It's written in layman terms. It's actually really easy to understand for anybody, even if you don't have an engagement background, around what that means and how to, you know, talk to community and be with community.
And also, we can have a look at our neighbours here in SA. Some of our other neighbouring states and territories are doing, I'm not saying they're the gold standard, but they're doing better than us. We can follow in their footsteps, and we can figure out what works for us and make some changes in that direction without having to have the answer before we start moving.
And we can learn from their mistakes, right?
Exactly.
So I can give you an example in terms of the Aboriginal participation policy. So South Australia doesn't have an Aboriginal participation policy. We are the only mainland state in this country that does not have one, right? Very similar to women in construction policies or frameworks or any of that sort of stuff. Exactly what you've said. I've read them all, don't worry. And I thought, what an opportunity we have now with the billions we're about to spend as a state to invest in basic fundamental frameworks and policy to drive that change, which aligns with the skills need. We've got that many women. You know, we talk about COVID, the situation with COVID, it was, you know, women were the most impacted in terms of economic impacts. We lost more jobs, more employment than men did, right? But they called it the pink recession and the blue recovery, right? Because where was all the money? Where is all the money still going? It's going into construction. It's going into infrastructure where there is not enough women to participate that. We have that many women dying in this country from domestic violence, and a lot of that has got to do with the lack of economic means to get out of these situations we're in. Our women over 50 population is the quickest growing homeless population in this country. And it's all fundamentally based on economic participation. But we're not seeing the fundamental policy changes within where all the funding is to drive that change. And as a mother of two daughters, I try to be optimistic about it, but, you know, when we're silenced or we're not engaged, then I become a little bit pessimistic on will we be building Torrens to Darlington by the time we have, and then will we see a women in construction policy? Or are we going to be building these tunnels and then get halfway through and go, we don't have enough labour in this state? Well, we knew that.
Yes.
So what did we do? We've been planning this project for over 20 years. The funding was announced 2-3 years ago or more under the Liberal government. Where were these fundamental policy changes at that time when we started doing investigations into what the design of the project looked like? So we're talking about technical here. So we're designing this project. We're going out and engaging with community and saying how many pedestrian bridges and where's your green spaces and blah, blah, blah. What about the people? What about the humanity around this project? Did we forget that all South Australians want to be a part of this? Because at the end of the day, it's coming out of our pockets, right? So we want to feel ownership. We want to feel part of this. We want to know our kids are going to get jobs. We want to know there's going to be apprenticeships. We want to know that we're going to see women in leadership on this project. And at the moment, there is very little emphasis around that in the government-funded projects. All I'm seeing it come from is BHP at this point.
Why is it not enough to say, oh, businesses will do the right thing?
Exactly right. So I know through my experience in procurement that organisations are paid to meet KPIs on industry participation, right? I don't know what that sum is. I don't know what those targets are because they're a commercial in confidence agreement between the contractor and the client. However, in South Australia, we have a fine of up to $10,000 if you do not meet your industry participation requirements, for example. So you can tell, so as a contractor, if I'm coming to you and saying, I'm going to employ 50% women on this project and 25% Aboriginal employment and 20% trainees or whatever you want to say, right? There is no repercussions for you as an organisation if you do not meet that. However, there is benefits, financial incentives if you do meet them. So where's the accountability to the taxpayer and the transparency to the community, the wider community, on are these people really being ethical in what they're saying? Because at the end of the day, you're an experienced woman in construction. You know that a response to a tender is a contract. It is a commitment to do something. So why are we not holding people accountable for these commitments in industry participation, women in construction, Aboriginal participation, those that live in the most socioeconomic disadvantaged areas in our state? There is no commitment and there is no accountability. And that just becomes tokenistic.
Yes. You grew up regionally and a lot of these things that we're kind of talking about were probably magnified out where you were. You wouldn't have had access to as many of the resources that people who live in suburbia do. Do you think you would still feel this way had you grown up in suburban Adelaide?
Probably not, because that would add another layer of almost privilege to my ability to be a city kid, access to education, don't have to leave home because the university is a bus or a train away. So in terms of affordability, the socio-demographics of the area so I was told, for example, I said to Mum when I was, I think, year 9 or 10, I want to be a lawyer, right? No surprises there, right? And I want to be a lawyer. And my uncle that lived in the city at the time said to me, yeah, well, you can come and stay at our house and you can go to uni from there. And my mum said to me, we can't afford it, Kiara. How are we going to pay for your board at your uncle's house? Because the problem was my uncle had 4 kids and was living below the poverty line as well. He has since gone to commit suicide.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. And he's since gone on and committed suicide. So the intergenerational trauma and the impacts of, growing up with domestic violence, barriers to education, barriers to employment, the desecration of my culture, the desecration of our identity. So the answer to your question in terms of being regionally based, does that drive a lot? Yes, it does. But I think what drives even more so is that those lived experiences that I've seen through my family, I feel like I've got a responsibility. I was born with that responsibility because I've been able to articulate or sit here to you today and articulate the experiences of my family and experiences of people that work for me and the challenges that we have. So, you know, that now continues to be into that, you know, for example, you know, the loss of my uncle continues to impact his children, you know, and their grandchildren and his grandchildren. So, you know, I'm still the only person in the family that owns a business. I'm still, like I said to you, I'm the only person that's even completed multiple diplomas, you know, but I continue to do that because I've got to break the cycle. But I still live with intergenerational trauma. I still, you know, I've been a victim of domestic violence for 10 years. Only in the last 2 years have I not experienced domestic violence myself. I was running a business while experiencing domestic violence at home, you know, and dealing with police and dealing with child protection even. So
I'm glad you brought up intergenerational trauma, and I would like to talk about it a bit further if you don't mind. And the reason that it's standing out to me is my husband is Indigenous Australian, and we've actually been talking a lot about intergenerational trauma in the past couple of weeks for various reasons. But we've really been, between the two of us, trying to reconcile what that means and what it can look like for different people.
Yes.
So for people who hear the phrase intergenerational trauma and think, oh, what does that mean? It didn't happen to you. Can we just take a step back and explain to them what that is and what that could look like from your perspective?
Yeah, so science actually has proven that it does disrupt the genetic makeup. So it's not just, you know, some hippie holistic idea that somebody come up with. It's actually scientifically proven. And like I said, so in my family, for example, you know, the intergenerational experiences of domestic violence has put us more predisposed to domestic violence. My grandfather was left in a boys' home and taken off of his Aboriginal mother when he was a baby. So therefore he had abandonment issues. He then left my mum when she was 8 months old and abandoned her. My mum and her brother have experienced consistent drug and alcohol abuse issues throughout their lives and also been exposed to domestic violence. So as a child that witnesses those sorts of things, and, you know, from the age of a small child, I knew what drug abuse was, and not because I was even living it in my family, but I was exposed to it through my extended family. You know, Christmas time, Arnie can't come because, you know, she crashed out because she's been up for a week, or, you know, something absolutely crazy, or family dramas because there's excessive alcohol abuse and substance abuse, which then impacts you. So it's, you know, and I know, you know, for friends of mine that are a part of the stolen generation, you know, they then experience similar issues with abandonment. Disconnection to culture is a huge thing.
Yeah.
So, you know, that identity issue is massive.
I was going to ask you, have you always felt connected to your culture and your identity in that sense?
I think that's also a driver for me because I haven't.
Yes.
So I've always felt spiritually connected. But in terms of my knowledge on culture and my identity as a member of my nation group, no. And because of that, you know, that 2 generations ago of my grandfather growing up in a boys' home and severely being abused and, you know, all of those sorts of things, we were disconnected. I'd only found out 2 days ago that my auntie, who's still alive, my great auntie, tells people that she's Indian. still to this day tells people she's Indian. So that has been so drummed into her that that's what she must say, that's what she says, still to this day. So
and that's a great, if we just pick up on that for a minute, you can see intergenerational trauma if we use that specific example, because then her children, if she has any, or nieces and nephews, if she has any, see that she's ashamed to own that part of her culture.
Absolutely.
So then they go, oh, should I feel shame in my culture as well? Oh, I'll also tell people that I'm Indian or, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
And that's how it keeps getting passed down, is because when you see the people that you look up to and who are raising you do things in a particular way, you take that on as either one, shame, or two, the right thing to do. And that's how it continues going through. Because my partner, again, he's going to watch this and really hate that I've brought him up so many times. But he used to not tick the box at school.
Yes.
As well, because he felt like it was putting him in a position where he was othered.
Yes. Yes.
And he used to say to me, because we've been together for quite a long time, he went, well, I looked like I could have been one of the other kids, so I pretended to be one. Yeah. And he's really only come to terms with his identity and who he is and the pride he feels in that and the connection that he feels in that in quite literally the last 3 years maybe. And I've really seen him come into his own and own that part of himself and see what it means for him. But I mean, he's in his mid-30s, so he didn't until his 30s, he didn't take any pride or have any connection. He felt a lot of shame around that. And when I look at his parents or his grandparents, I don't really think that they did. I don't see those behaviours. But it is what he's been taught in society and how that sort of played out for him as a young boy and teenager and into his 20s, whereas now he's like, no, this is who I am and I'm not ashamed of this.
And it's not dissimilar to our situation as women, isn't it? Like, you know, if we don't have any women in leadership positions that we can aspire to be or seek mentoring and support from, then, you know, we feel uncomfortable and it's almost unjust that we can't raise certain issues. You know, we're talking now about menopause and endometriosis and all of these other really important subjects that have been kept very quiet and out of the workplace for the fact that we can't it's difficult to raise this with men because they wouldn't understand how that feels. And that's similar to how, you know, people like your partner are feeling like, who's he going to talk to about it? Because, you know, unless he talks to someone like me who's had similar experiences, but then there's shame in that as well, because then you go, oh, will that Aboriginal person think that I'm a bad person that I haven't identified? Well, no, we don't, because we all share different stories. And in our culture, storytelling is important. And I've always been empowered by my elders through learning through work. And this is where my connection strongly comes from through the work I do, is that I am no less Aboriginal than somebody that lives in an remote Aboriginal community, you know, and that's taken me probably 10, 15 years to really understand those words that were given to me by that elder that day. So, you know, because I did feel less superior. So then you have shame within your own community. So you have shame in that community, you have shame in that community, and you have no idea where you fit.
How do we air out shame?
We've got to talk about it and we've got to educate people, you know, no different to what we're dealing with any of minority groups or, you know, people with, I guess, barriers to employment and those sorts of things. We need to become educated. And as leaders, it's our responsibility to educate ourselves. You know, I think it's so important. So the way I guess I deal with my trauma of every day being a woman in construction is educating myself. So consistently I have a goal that every year I do something that upskills myself. So for example, I'm also a member of the Peter Cullen Environment and Water Trust, which is a group started off as predominantly scientists. I think I I graduated from the program last year in May, I think it was, and I was the only non-scientist as part of my group, right? And I felt so uncomfortable on day one where everyone I'm surrounded, I think there was one civil engineer. She also felt a little bit out of school as well because she worked in the water space. But, then we're leaders, right? So we have to overcome that fear. That's what we do every day. Particularly women, we sort of, imposter syndrome, we deal with that constantly. I actually went on and won the Leaf Bawley Award for the Peter Cullen Trust, which has only been given out twice in the history of the trust, the history of the 15 years of the trust. So that award acknowledges somebody that lives every day by the values of the trust. And we are an organisation that really prides ourselves on leadership in policy, particularly water and environment policy, which obviously impacts First Nations people quite significantly. And given we're in a climate crisis, it's quite important. So that just adds the value, adds sort of that learning experience to me. And now I've networked with these bunch of incredible humans that are constantly giving their life, not just their career, but their lives to, a sustainable future where we've all have access to clean drinking water and, we're protecting our environment. So that's how I learn, that's how I grow, and that's how I overcome the trauma of dealing with some situations like mansplaining or, I go home and I reflect, and I reflect on the learnings that I've had from these leadership programs and on all these amazing men that exist that aren't like that want to see change, that want to drive change, but are probably too small of a minority at the moment, let's face it. There's too not enough of them, and maybe there's more, but they're too afraid to stand up because of the fear of the unknown.
Congratulations on that recognition. That's very impressive.
Thank you.
I think what you said about learning and being educated is so, so important. I think sometimes it can feel intimidating to learn and unlearn in a lot of ways the things that you do know. So I guess what I would say is at the bare minimum, we should just try and listen and we should just try and empathize. I agree, education is the key. I do agree with that. I think that can feel like such a barrier for people sometimes. And so because of that, I would like to give them the step before that, which is just listen. Don't be defensive. It's not about you. It's about the situation. It's about the environment. Can we just absorb it, go home and reflect? And if we go, you know what, I actually do need to educate myself further. Perfect. But at the very least, just don't argue with it. Yeah,
exactly. Go with it. Go with it. Be with it. Exactly what you said. Listen to it. And in terms of education, like we talk about, my organisation talks about in cultural respect training, is that, we can self-educate, right? It's not about going through a formal training process or attending a cultural awareness training. There's plenty of cultural tours on the weekends that you can go with your kids, and frankly, our kids are better at this stuff. They learn more about it, particularly in the education system is improving with those sorts of things. So listen to your kids, learn from your kids and see, and experience those cultures and the different ways to view the world, because I think young people are definitely the solution to a lot of that too.
And it can be scary to go out in the world and seek those things out. I completely acknowledge that. Listen to a podcast. You can do it from your couch, actually, or read a book or go to anywhere and read some plaques or something like that. It can feel confronting to try and go out of your comfort zone in that way, but there's a lot of ways that you can absorb things and learn and listen and take it in that don't really take anything away from you or what you're trying to do. And you can do it at home, you can do it in pajamas, start somewhere.
Absolutely. 100% agree.
Your businesses, so you listed 3 of them?
Yes.
What are they all? Can you briefly describe what they do?
Okay, so my consulting business was KSJ Consulting. That was the first one created nearly 7 years ago now. So that's an Aboriginal affairs consulting business. So we work with government, non-for-profits, commercial organisations to develop policy, strategies, frameworks, undertake research and data collection. For example, we were heavily involved in the new renewable energy legislation, being the first state and the first country in the world to have legislation of that type.
Mm-hmm.
So KSJ facilitated the engagement with all 26 First Nation native title groups across the state. So we supported the Department of Energy and Mining to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the sorts of things. So last week, for example, I spent the week in Port Augusta engaging with the regional groups on First Nations, advancing First Nations water rights and starting to have a discussion around what that actually looks like
Mm-hmm.
for the state. And also talking about a project for infrastructure and transport around the road maintenance contracts and how we can support regional and remote Aboriginal people through that contract. So that's KSJ.
Mm-hmm.
Platinum, it's always been, I guess, a passion of mine I love civil construction, right? I've worked in it since I was 18 years old, on and off, because it was difficult to work in construction when I had young children.
Mm-hmm.
So I went into government during those times so that I could be somewhat present with my children. So anyway, I started that, I think it's 4 years ago this year. So we are now I would say we'd have to be the largest female-owned civil construction company in South Australia, regardless of the fact I'm Aboriginal.
Yeah, I would almost say possibly Australian.
Yeah, there's another Aboriginal woman in Northern Territory who's got a really successful civil construction company. I'm yet to meet her, so shout out to you if we can catch up at some point. But yeah, I'm definitely one of the biggest in South Australia for a female, and definitely the biggest Aboriginal female-owned company. And I own 65% of my company. So I would say that I would have to be the largest majority in terms of majorities. Yep. I would be the largest. So we recently were awarded the ad hoc civils contract for Olympic Dam, and that sort of spearheaded our partnership with BHP. BHP have been extremely receptive to not only Aboriginal business, but particular focus on female participation. But that's more in the employment space at this stage. Mm-hmm. They haven't sort of moved into female-owned businesses yet. However, in saying that, they're certainly very receptive to the fact that I'm also a female-owned business, so I'm very well supported. Mm-hmm. But we said this off camera again before, I feel like I'm really well supported with BHP, listened to, heard, invited to the table, and that's because there is a high percentage of female leaders within that organisation. So I can't be sure that that's the reason, but
it's a contributing factor, right? And if you look around at any of the other engagements that you've done or clients and things like that, or other businesses that don't have anything to do with you, and we think, okay, but what's different about this one? That's a pretty glaringly obvious thing that's different about this one. And whether that's a coincidence or not, okay, but it's happening, and we can see that this is possibly one of the reasons why. We don't know because there's not enough case studies to prove it. Let's do some more. Let's try and disprove it.
Yeah.
Let's get more people in and see if it doesn't work. But I'm guessing that it's going to.
Absolutely. And I think, and the level of respect that I receive, not just from my staff, but from the clients, because there is multiple clients. It's quite a large organisation. So yes. I'm dealing with so many different people. But how receptive they are is amazing. I'm not assumed to be the admin girl, the office admin girl when I go up there. I support the pre-start meetings when I'm there. I'm there every fortnight. I feel safe in camp. I feel safe walking around in camp. Now, 20 years ago, when I worked on a mining site, I was put with the catering staff because they were predominantly female, because I was not safe to be positioned with the rest of general population in camp. So, I like to talk about that because I think, that's shown how rapidly things have changed. Like, when 20 years ago, when I worked in the mining industry, I was the only woman. I wasn't allowed to go to our work functions because I was the only woman that worked in the business, and my manager thought that it might be unsafe if I go to a work barbecue, for example.
They didn't want to have to deal with it in case something happened.
That's right.
They go, the paperwork, if someone else behaves badly towards you,
I don't even know if there'd be paperwork. There probably wasn't even paperwork.
Yeah, probably
there was no such thing. Like, where there was this scary word that, terrified men, sexual harassment, majority men, not all men. But, I reflect back on that now and I think, oh my, as a leader in my company, I couldn't imagine that happening. And in fact, I actually take it to the next level and I invite partners and children out to functions as well. I think it's really critical for an organisation to value the family, particularly in construction, given, high suicide rates, major depression, all of these awful statistics we've got in construction. So it's not just about women and it's not just about Aboriginal people, but it's about men's mental health and it's about ensuring that the families feel valued and important, and I'm able to have discussions directly with partners and things and their children so we can just have that connection. And that's completely up to them. It's completely voluntary, but I always attempt to make sure that I know their kids' names, that I know, their partners' names. And while the organisation is semi-medium, it's probably okay to do that. And I'll have to think of another innovative way to do it once we continue to grow.
What's your third business? Sorry.
So my third business is Argyle Group Training Organisation. So that's been set up and yet to sort of fully launch, if you like.
I didn't see that in my research, and I'm pretty good at research.
No. So it's out there, but it's not. It's something again that I'm really interested in, sort of using that vehicle to promote women in construction.
Yep.
So how I do that, I don't know just yet, but there's other amazing women with great minds out there that I often talk to, and that's a sort of an ongoing vehicle for potentially that to happen one day.
How many employees do you have across those three businesses in total, roughly?
I would say at least about 50 at this point. We're about to bring on another 10. So
that's huge. Congratulations on that as well.
Yeah. No, I wake up and pinch myself most days and go, wow, like, how did this happen? And sort of,
Well, hard work, dedication, passion, focus, that's how it happened. No one gave it to you, did they?
But I still question myself, right? I still consistently question myself about my capabilities to be able to do this, even though I've already done it.
I think that's okay, because what I would say to that is if you weren't questioning yourself and if you were taking it for granted and if your ego got bigger than this room, you're probably not a leader anymore. Perhaps you're like tipping into manager, and we've already discussed why we think being a leader is better. So I think holding on to that part that has a little bit of doubt and still has that drive and still questions is how you're able to keep growing, because it keeps you grounded is my guess.
And remaining grounded is such a personal goal of mine, because it's so easily like you can get distracted so easily. But I guess I need to make sure that I measure my success not just on the growth of the business in terms of financial employee numbers, But, you know, I'm consistently reaching out to staff, making sure that the staff see that the values of our organisation is still as important as they were yesterday, today.
What are those values?
So those values are ensuring that those most disadvantaged people have opportunities to sit at that board table, and that we create those pathways. So, you know, that's my sort of vision and mission, to drive those opportunities, because again, I knew, and that was one of the reasons I created Platinum, my construction business, was that I wasn't getting those opportunities to sit at the table. I was consistently in the same job for the last almost 20 years. Because I had 3 children, I would take another, 2-3 years step back in my career where I was having to find jobs that, I've got a daughter with disabilities, for example. So that meant that I needed to work part-time because I needed to take her to her OT, speech therapy, all of those sorts. So, I had not just the fact I was a single mum at that point, I was also dealing with a child with disabilities, but I needed the financial income to be able to support her, to get her to those medical appointments. So, I had all these different challenges. And I guess, thinking about that, I must remain humble. Because I can't be who I am, and I wouldn't be where I am today if I wasn't the Kiara. I've got to maintain the Kiara I've always been and be true to myself, but also create boundaries, because I think I've been pretty poor in the past at creating boundaries, because I feel like I want to give, and I'm so passionate about helping everyone and supporting the community and driving change and self-sacrifice at all costs sometimes. I've had to really, really work on my political nous, if you like, and my ability to get those messages across to people that perhaps don't want to listen. So there's like one of my aunties in Port Augusta says, there's more than one way to skin a cat, the old country saying. And so I often listen to wise people around how to navigate politics so that I can be heard and I can be seen, because, the fear still drives a lot of people.
Do you have people around you who keep you grounded, or is that something that you're actively doing for yourself?
I think my family do that, particularly my brother. So I've only got one sibling, my brother, and he actually works for me in Platinum Civil. And, we've had discussions about, I've tried to support him multiple times to get his own business up and going and those sorts of things, but he's just not interested, right? But he'll be the first one to tell me if he thinks I'm getting ahead of myself, or and my dad is really a realist, and he can be very hard on me. And I actually think when I reflect on how that transpired through my childhood and how he was really strict and really tough on me, like 99%'s not good enough kind of thing. It's not because he didn't think it was good enough. It's because he wanted to, it was his weird way of driving me to keep pushing forward, that I could do better. So it's actually helped me in construction, because he's quite a gruff, old school blokey bloke. So no one scares me, right?
You're like, have you met my dad? Because you're not scary.
That's right. I've worked with some really scary superintendents out there and construction managers. And it was funny because I used to be the one that used to have to deliver the messages to them when I was the admin girl, because no one else wanted to. Everyone was scared of them. I'll do it. He's not that scary, So now that I'm a contractor, I do have to deal with quite difficult situations and confronting situations with quite intimidating looking people, particularly people that work for me even. But the way that I deal with it, I think because of my superpower of being a woman, I use that superpower to be able to have conversations that men perhaps couldn't have with those types of men, because we come at it at a different way,
and they weren't taught necessarily some of the skills to be able to navigate those conversations. I mean,
Absolutely. That, I think that's a skill that not everybody, like communication is,
it's on every job ad and 10% of people actually know how to do it.
Exactly right. But I think, that in a way, this is where we need to explore like the neurodivergent people with Asperger's, people with autism. I've got a cousin with severe Asperger's. He hasn't left the house in 6 months. He hasn't literally left his house in 6 months. But this young man is one of the most intelligent people I've ever met in my life. And I think, that is another challenge for us as the human race is how do we get the best out of people, you know?
And I'd like to just challenge your language a little bit there, if that's okay.
Yeah.
He has Asperger's, I think we say ASD now, and he is the most intelligent person. It's not exclusive. He is all of those things.
Yes.
And it's not that something that he is for whatever takes away and is or like this, but like this and this.
But that's not how he sees it. And that's not how he would talk about that.
Of course not, because that's not how we use the language, is it?
No, and it's wrong. Absolutely. I agree with you 100%, right? But that's how you have to explain it to 99% of the population, including people like himself, because we don't know any better. Like we haven't had those educational practices, and I'm not the right person to explore those opportunities, but I'm raising it now because again, it's another opportunity to look at how we as a workforce, how we adapt and change to make sure that we create opportunities for everyone, not just, like we say, not just women, not just Aboriginal people, but everyone. So hey, there's a lot of us that are running around undiagnosed as well. That's my little inside joke. Like I know I have ADHD, right? My daughter has it, but she's actually been diagnosed. I haven't been diagnosed, but I think that's my superpower in a way, because that's why I don't stop. I just don't stop. I am constant. It drives my work ethic. It drives my strategic thinking. So yeah, you're dead right. These things, these neurodivergency things or labels almost are superpowers in my mind.
Yeah, and it's not just neurodivergency either. It could be she is a civil engineer and a mother and has ADHD and owns a business. Not, she's a civil engineer but she's a mum. Like, what do you mean? And it's like we can't cut up these bits of people and get rid of the bits that we don't like, because otherwise you're not going to get that whole person that's going to be able to bring to the table what you need.
But we're still hiding that, right? We spoke about that before. We're still hiding the fact we're mums, or still, keeping a lot of that on the down low, or that we have a child with disabilities, or, mental health conditions, or whatever it is.
Yes.
And I think if society, and this is why I put myself out there, and this is why I'm sitting here now today talking to you and probably risking my relationship with some of my clients, given that I've really given it to government over the last half an hour. Is that I have a responsibility because I have a voice and because I have that ability to do it and because I am a communicator. So what kind of human would I be, regardless of who I am, business owner or not? Who would I be if I didn't use that voice to support those around me that don't have a voice?
And I mean, I hope you haven't damaged any relationships with clients based on what you said, because nothing you've said has been about any particular person or group being bad. It's about saying, hey, just letting you know, these are the areas where I feel like you could do a lot better. Here's some ideas on how to do it, and I will talk to you about it further. If anyone in particular has an issue with that, that's on them, truthfully.
Truthfully, it is. And if I had family connections, intergenerational wealth, like Mr. Drake, he can come out and say whatever he likes.
Yes.
Because he's a multi-millionaire. So it doesn't matter what he says. Those in that level of society, those that are think they're in that level of society, not saying he does, but those with that kind of wealth can get away and say whatever they want. But, you know, Joe Blow that grew up in the country, or Sally that, you know, went to the poorest school in the northern suburbs of Adelaide would really struggle to get an audience. And if she said half the things that he did, you know, let's face it.
Yep.
No one would listen.
Because you don't have the safety net. You don't have the safety net there.
Right.
So, I mean, yes, I say I hope that it doesn't damage any relationships. It could if people take it that way, and it does
in this industry. It's not that it could. It actually does.
Yeah,
you know, I wrote a post on LinkedIn. I'll give you a perfect example.
Please.
I put a post on LinkedIn probably a month ago maybe, and it was calling on water industry leaders to do better, right? There was no names, there was no nothing. But just at that time, I wrote that post because, one, I'm part of the Peter Cullen Trust. That's part of my commitment and my values and, you know, part of being a fellow of the trust, but also a social advocate. I'm 40 under 40, you know, social award recipient last year. So, you know, on one hand, I'm getting awarded for this sort of, you know, conversation. And then on the other hand, I got a phone call from an agency to ask me to take the post down.
Yep.
And I was just blown away. I was actually really upset. And I said to them, but if I don't call out water leaders to do better in Aboriginal
Who's
affairs,
going to?
Who is?
Yeah. Well, nobody. That's the point. You have to be quiet.
And if you didn't like what I said, then there must be a problem.
100%.
So anyway, long story short, I went and discussed it with my team. And my team said, for the sake of our jobs, Kiara, can you just take that down? So I said, yes, I will. But I want you guys to know that is my belief. These are the values in which we live. Our organisation is built upon. And they live for that. Like, they work for me because of that. So it was really difficult for me to take that post down because I felt like I was giving in to it. But then at the same time, they asked me because of their jobs. And I went, well, you know, I'm weighing up the right thing to do by humanity, and Kiara always putting herself out there and saying what she believes, and then people's jobs.
It's such an interesting point to raise. On one hand, you get propped up and awarded for it, and on the other hand, you get torn down. And I think that's true of a lot of people who play in the advocacy space and are outspoken online and in the industry. I think it's a lot worse for women, but perhaps we just take gender out of it for a second. Why do you think people are so happy to push you up on one hand and tear you down for almost the exact same thing? What's going on there?
Well, I'm a good news story sometimes when it fits the narrative, right? And, you know, I've been quoted as one of the most influential Aboriginal women in business in Australia, you know, but then I've never been asked to speak to one chief executive in this state about Aboriginal participation.
Yeah, so it's like, what do you actually mean, though? So, like, what do you mean I'm influential? You're not listening to me.
Yeah, I'm influential, but just shut up when we feel we need you to, you know, just be quiet.
They'll wheel you out when it suits the agenda and then ask you just to chill out a bit when it's too much.
And that's what I get, right? I get this feedback, you're too much. It's like, no, I'm sick of you telling women and people that they're too much. If women didn't fight in the 60s and 70s for our rights, if Aboriginal people hadn't been continuing to pursue our rights, we would still be in chains. We would actually, it'd be probably a complete eradication of our culture altogether.
Yeah, I agree.
So I'm okay to be too much as long as it doesn't affect my staff, right? So at the end of the day, like I said, someone said to me the other day, you either need to make a decision, Kiara, you either need to become a politician or a business owner.
Interesting.
Right? But how many politicians do we know that actually were business owners or are business owners? A lot.
I was like, almost all of them, question mark?
That's where their wealth comes from. That's how they can afford to become ministers. Because they built their wealth. They built their platform.
And if someone came and took all of that away from them, they still have a nice big cushion underneath them
Yes.
of money.
Yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah.
So, but because I'm Aboriginal and because I'm female, I've got multiple barriers to being able to do that. So I would love to be a politician, right? I don't have any particular party that I support. I support depending on what policies I believe in. And I think a lot of the younger generation are doing that nowadays. I think it's very, that's a changing environment as well, which is for the better because we're holding people accountable a lot more than we used to. But at the same time, I feel like I need to play in that space, but not play in that space too strongly. And then, but as an Aboriginal woman, I'm expected to have some say in that space. So I always tell people, like I said it to my young engineer this morning when we were having a one-on-one session, I said to him, because he asked me about, me playing in politics and how he worries about that and how does that impact our business. And I said, my thing is I need to stir up a little bit of chitter-chatter because if I stir up the chitter-chatter, it creates a conversation about platinum. It creates a conversation about KSJ, and they will create a challenge for me. And sometimes that challenge means work. Well, if that means that's my name that has to create that and has to do that on behalf of my community and my staff, then I'm going to do it.
Because I think people could look at it, and I've had this discussion, a similar discussion on Couch before with one of our guests, Louisa, and we talked a lot about sexual harassment, and she's quite outspoken with that online and what she posts, and she calls it out. And we sort of had that chat about how does that potentially impact your career and do you like being the spokesperson for this? And she's like, not really, but no one else is doing it. And I feel like you're sort of telling me a similar narrative is you can look at me online and see all this stuff and you might think she just loves posting and very passionate and blah, blah, blah. But it's like, deep down it has to be done. And if it has to be you, then fine. If someone else wants to do it, awesome. But that's not happening, is it?
No. And it just triggered me around my association with women in construction and that whole, where I sit with that.
Yep.
I tend to stay out of that environment because I'm already doing a lot in the Aboriginal affairs environment. But one thing that's really disappointed me about a lot of representation around women in construction is that it's often women at it can be women, organisations find comfort in women that represent women at lower levels of their not lower levels, but how would I describe that?
More junior, perhaps? More
junior levels of employment and less experience in leadership, right? So so that's been quite frustrating as well. And I think it's not dissimilar to Aboriginal affairs, right? So you look at a lot of committees that are created by mainstream organisations. These committees are often made up of the yes people. And I'm just going to call it out, right? The yes people, the people that have self-interest, right? If we're genuinely going to make change, and this is why I agreed to come on the couch with you, because when you pitched your organisation, I was like, wow, those values, I'm finally seeing those values transpire in something about women in construction. Because I still think we are still viewed as some of our associations as the housewives of almost the mainstream organisations that represent construction. Does that make sense?
Yes. It's sort of like, oh, you've got a fun little tea party group on the side. I think that's what you're trying to say. And it's interesting because, I mean, I'm quite heavily involved in NAWIC and I have been for a long time. So I know the people who volunteer and I know what they're passionate about and I know why we're all here and that's why I've remained in that community and aligned with them for so long.
Yes.
And that's the truth of the matter. I can see why you would look at some organisations and perhaps even like ours sometimes and think that it's like that, or some people are actually like that. I don't know. I can't speak for them or what they're doing, but it is about, okay, but what are we actually doing to move the dial, and where is the evidence for that? And there is so much power in the networks and the groups that are made from these things, but are we all just getting together to whinge about stuff, or are we all getting together to actually identify issues, come up with a plan and move them forward, or create things like this or the advocacy things that are getting rolled out by NAWIC nationally to actually make a difference? And I think that's what's important.
And using it 100%, right? So this is why I don't waste my time with a lot of these other, but I'm very specific about what I support.
Yes. And we talked about that, right? When I first approached you about it, you said, look, I'm not sure. And I said, perfect, let's have a chat.
Yeah.
I don't need you to be like, falling at my feet saying yes.
No.
I'm very happy that you said, look, to be completely honest with you, Rach, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I typically align with these things. I'm not sure that it's for me. This is where I stand. And I said, have a chat with me.
Yeah.
And we'll go from there.
And we did. And then I learned more about the organisation and more about the values and where it stands and how it can support women like me. And I don't have time for a lot of the networking stuff, right?
Yes.
But what I want to see is, like Louisa said, we don't want to be individualized in terms of our advocacy. We need organizations like that to write to the highest authorities in this country to say enough is enough. We need a women in construction policy, right? Enough. It's got to stop, right? So, like I said, Torrance to Darlington's happening. We've got the major contractor. Does anybody know what's in that contract for women in construction?
I'm guessing not much.
Do we know what the KPIs for that are?
No.
Has that been discussed with any of us women?
I suspect the reason that we don't know is because we don't really want to know what the answer is. But
right? My point exactly. And I know this Premier has a women's council of some sort, and there's some amazing women part of that organisation, and I've offered my time multiple times to go and talk to them about the opportunity to, what it's like for me in the construction industry. I think Anna Wiley, the BHP asset president's on that, women's council. She is another incredible female leader, right?
Yep.
So I think we do have the numbers there. Like, we do have these incredible women, the governor of South Australia being a woman. We have these opportunities now, but I almost think that it needs to be more than networking. We need to take it to the next level. We need to write to the highest powers. We need to talk to the media about what's actually going on. We need and power in numbers, right? Because I don't want to consistently do the advocacy for Aboriginal business. I don't want to be consistently talking and on LinkedIn about, the travesties that are going on in the world and how backwards we're going with Aboriginal affairs in some respects. I want the networking for me needs to be about advancing a collective of people that share the same values, which NAWIC is, and that's a tick for me after we had that conversation. But what next? What next for us women? And we need to capitalize on what we have in front of us.
I normally finish the episodes by asking why you agreed to come on NAWIC Couch, but we did talk about that already. So I would like to finish on, what do you love most about construction?
The challenge, the camaraderie, as much as, it is difficult in terms of diversity and inclusion. Fun. It's so much fun. And to build things and watch infrastructure build
deeply
and support.
Satisfying.
Oh, it is amazing. Yeah. Every time I drive down through the T2T, I say, Mum, help build this, kids. And that'll be there when my great grandkids are around, and it's just so rewarding. So I don't know, I'm addicted to it in a nutshell. I always say, like, am I crazy? What am I doing working here? Like, this is so challenging. But like I said, I couldn't imagine not working in construction and not working in Aboriginal affairs.
I'm glad that you have found what truly aligns with your passion and you're just doing it so well and with so much intention and integrity, and I really respect that about you.
Thank you. And look, apologies for my attire today.
Never apologise.
This is genuinely, authentically me. I've been at site, 6:30 this morning for a pre-start. So I've just come straight there and straight here. So,
Is there anything that you would have liked to use your voice to platform today that we haven't touched on?
No, I just hope that I've been able to shed, some light on some topics and hopefully being able to articulate enough, I guess, the challenges, but the opportunities and the strengths and where I see, women going in construction and where I see, particularly around the opportunities. And I would encourage anyone that listens to this podcast to reach out, or this video, to reach out to me and connect with me. And if there's something they would like to ask, chat to me. I'm more than happy to catch up.
That's really generous of you to offer, and I'm sure you have a lot of connections that if you're not the right person to ask, you can connect them with the person
100%,
that is.
100%. And that's what women need to do. We need to support each other. No matter what committee or association we're part of, we need to support each other.
Because that's how we move forward together.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for your time. I deeply appreciate it.
Thank you.